Ladies and gentlemen, this is DVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and all welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we tackle one of the most convoluted geopolitical puzzles of our time, the settlement of the Russian-Ukrainian war. With countless lives lost on the ground, this is a tragic story where big ambitions meet the harsh, unyielding reality of international politics. When Moscow's involved, every peace negotiation is similar to a dinner party, where Russia brings a big ego and a large serving of territorial claims, while the rest of the world sits awkwardly. How could this time around be any different, and what does Vladimir Putin want to get from the negotiations? Well, here's a look at our latest report to find out more.
Even before Donald Trump returned to office, Moscow had been sending signals that it was ready to talk about ending the war in Ukraine. Prior to the 2024 election, the signals were mixed at best. Since that time, though, messages like these are far from uncommon.
We see statements by the current president expressing his willingness to work together. We are always open to this.
Until very recently, Russia had seen a string of successes on the battlefield. While it hasn't been able to push Ukrainian forces out of Kursk, despite retaking half of the captured territory, Moscow's forces had the advantage in occupied Ukraine and were pushing for the key city of Pokrovsk. So why would a supposedly winning Russia want to talk? Trump's eagerness to engage with Putin has raised some eyebrows.
I'll be dealing with President Putin largely on the phone, and we ultimately expect to meet.
What's more, the US president often touts his past relationship with the Russian president from the time of his first term. Ukraine's absence in the upcoming US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia has not gone unnoticed. Neither has Europe's lack of an invitation.
Politically, it's very important to stay together, and when it's security guarantees from the United States and Europe, it have to be together.
The new US administration has not spared harsh words towards the European Union, such as those spoken by Vice President J.D. Vance. Some observers point out that in fact the new administration has had more good to say about Russia than its allies. A wedge of division is forming within NATO.
There must be no division of security and responsibility between Europe and the United States.
European leaders are scrambling in the wake of the Munich Security Conference. They are now seeking solutions to prevent the bloc from being sidelined in the upcoming peace negotiations. But the threads of European politics are and have been pulled in many different directions for years, raising the question of whether this time will be any different.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, first thing first, the idea of a settlement in this context sounds about as comforting as being promised a spa day by your archenemy. We're talking about settling a full-scale war in a conflict that's been simmering for years, way before thousands of tanks rolled into Ukraine. Dreams of respecting neatly drawn borders and compromises read like a wish list from a particularly delusional genie. Now, if you ever watch international negotiations, you'll know they often leave much to be desired. And while there's sanctions, military posturing, and backroom deals on the table, the rest of us are left wondering if there's any room for actual dialogue amid the theatrics. Because the settlement process can be less about genuine conciliation and more about staging a political performance, especially when Moscow's at the table. The irony here is that on one hand, you have ambitions painted in broad strokes of lost blood and national pride, and then on the other, the stark reality of shattered trust and entrenched positions. And let's not kid ourselves. The players in this geopolitical story are not exactly your friendly neighborhood negotiators. Russia's stance with its historical narratives and strategic imperatives is as non-negotiable as a toddler's demand for an extra cookie. Ukraine, fighting not just for land but for the very right to self-determination, brings a resolve that's as courageous as difficult to sustain. And the international community, well, they're the referees, trying desperately to enforce rules that seem to be written in disappearing ink. The stage is set, the players are ready, and the script, if you can call it that, is about to be written. Ambitions, on paper, look neat and tidy, promising a harmonious future where every border is respected and every grievance is addressed. But when you zoom in on the messy details, you find that reality is less cooperative. It's the enforcement of the peace proposals that is like the crux of the matter. Instead of neatly resolved dispute, we're left with questions that multiply. How do you balance historical claims with modern realities? How do you reconcile national pride with international law? And most importantly, who exactly gets to decide which version of history wins? Amid all the lofty promises and high-minded rhetoric, the human cost of this conflict is often left out of the conversation. Every diplomatic maneuver, every carefully worded concession is a reminder that real lives hang in the line. Now, here's to hope the settlement can become more than a fragile truce in a land where the flame of resentment are all too easily rekindled. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rasmus Nielsen, a lecturer at the University College London. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So today we're looking at this peace negotiation from the Russian perspective, as of course all eyes are now on this discussion taking place in Saudi Arabia. And well, as opposed to kind of taking the European, the Ukrainian perspective, I also want to know what the Russian perception of all of it is. Do you think they believe that they hold all the cards going into this discussion?
I don't know if they believe they hold all the cards, but they do believe they're in a favorable position, thanks to the arrival of the Trump administration in particular. What the Russians want from this is, overall, they want normalization of their attack on Ukraine. They want that activity to be normalized in the sense that it does not keep them out of world society. Now, what does normalization look like from the Russian point of view? I think you can summarize it if you look at the military angle, the economic angle, the political angle. On the military angle, Russia wants a ceasefire. They don't want peace, but they want a ceasefire for now in Ukraine. That's the immediate aim. On the economic side, they want a relaxation or removal of sanctions, something which they can get from the Americans, if not the Europeans. And on the political side, the Russians want equality in the eyes of the world, equal status with the Americans on a number of issues, such as the war in Ukraine, but also peace in the Middle East, and also, say, the nuclear weapons issue. So those are the main headlines for what Russia wants in the negotiations with the Americans.
Right. And how feasible are these requests? When it comes to the military side of things, we do know that perhaps the Trump administration is very forward about wanting to see at least the fighting come to an end in the short term. But when it comes to the political aspect, like you mentioned, perhaps this equality, even let's say America does decide to, well, give some semblance of equality, don't you think that the possibility of a European looking at this in a kind of equal footing to be probably less than likely?
I don't think the Europeans as such will accept that. However, it looks to me reasonably clear now that the Americans might be willing to do a deal with the Russians for some level of, photo op, some level of internationally equal status, at least the optics of it, that the Americans would be willing to do that in return for Russia pulling a bit further away from Iran, a bit further away from North Korea and China. You can already see that there have been feelers out from the Americans on that issue, and the Russians, although they would not be willing to give up their relationship with China, might be willing to hint to the Americans that some sort of overall settlement of world affairs can be done. And that, of course, would play into Trump's self-image as a deal maker in international affairs. So when it comes to the political side, in terms of Russian-American relations, I think what the Russians are looking for appears possible.
Right. Do you think that bodes well, though, with the image that he's trying to create, like this great deal maker, even if somehow Russia distances itself from China and North Korea? Those aren't exactly the kind of people that Trump wants to impress.
Well, Trump wants to impress the world. I mean, I must say, if we go back to his first term in office, that is Donald Trump's first term, he did seem as if he was very comfortable and very happy to be around so-called strongmen, that is, authoritarian dictators around the world. Trump looks at the world, and the American administration looks at the world now in a completely transactional way. So if they can show to their people at home and to themselves that they are getting immediate sort of benefits for the optics, but maybe also some economic benefits from collaboration with the Russians, they would be doing so. I think we need to understand, in Europe in particular, where this would definitely not be a sustainable solution. But I think we need to understand that we're now dealing with a totally and completely transactional American administration. The Russians seem to have understood this, and this is giving the Russian administration some hope.
All right, and speaking of the Russian administration, the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov has came out and stated that, well, basically they want to keep all the annexed territory and probably, if not, and then some. Do you think on that aspect it is feasible?
I think that depends on what we're looking at. So if we're looking at what they might be able to agree with the Americans, yes, it is possible. I don't think the Americans will necessarily give it up straight away. They will want something in return. But again, if the Russians can send out some signals that maybe they're willing to distance themselves slightly from China, or maybe more likely that they're willing to do a deal with the Americans over the Middle East, then I think the Americans would be willing to give them this. In fact, part of the American administration have indicated this already. I certainly don't hope that the European governments are willing to accede to this. And so far, I'm quietly encouraged, not a lot, but quietly encouraged by the European reaction to what's happened in the last week. But yes, I think the Russians might be able to persuade the Americans that Russia should keep the territories they have stolen from the Ukrainians.
Right, and you mentioned something earlier that perhaps Russians were able to give themselves a slightly more favorable position compared to the previous administration by understanding that the current administration is one of a very transactional nature. It's kind of a give and take. Do you think that there is something to be said there about the European leaders that perhaps they should also start taking in, well, that kind of angle of conception when it comes to dealing with American administration, and perhaps also give them a better understanding on how to proceed with negotiation with the new administration?
I think that the European governments are doing that to some extent already. So, for instance, you have seen repeated vows that Europe would increase its military spending within NATO and in general. That is a signal to the Americans that we are willing to pay for this sort of collaboration as well. But you can also see now, for instance, the EU Commission is beginning to talk about how things could become quite difficult for for American tech companies in Europe, say, if relations got worse. There are small hints out of both, if you like, stick and carrot in relations to the Americans. And that may be the most feasible way forward. However, we do have to understand that there is a limit to how far the Europeans can trade away European security. It's one thing for Donald Trump, who has and is going to have even more domestic economic and social problems at home, to want to go to Europe and try and deflect, trying to create some not very long-lasting deals in order to change the media narrative. That's one thing. But for the Europeans, a sustainable peace has to be achieved in Ukraine. There's a limit to how much you can simply trade away because you need to please the American administration.
Right, very much so. And well, let's move on to what you mentioned also, the economic aspect of what Russians are trying to gain from it, mostly the lifting of the sanctions. Well, we do know that not just American sanctions, but a lot of the European sanctions being put into place, well, has been putting Russians in a stranglehold. Do you think that that might change going forward? Or do you think that the American administration will be keeping that as a leverage, as a bargaining tool in going into this negotiation?
So just on the sanctions, first of all, I think it's right what you're indicating, that although the sanctions may not have struck the Russian economy as quickly as was originally expected, they are beginning to have an effect, absolutely. I think it's not something the American administration would be willing to give away straight away, but yes, I do absolutely see it as possible that the Americans might end up being willing to lift sanctions on Russia in return for various not particularly tangible concessions from the Russians. I don't, as things stand, see the Europeans being willing to give up sanctions. However, if the Americans give up some or all sanctions on the Russians, there will certainly be some European governments, I'm for instance looking at the governments in Hungary or in Slovakia, who might be willing to follow the Americans in this. So it could be the beginning of a slippery slope.
All right, so yeah, a lot of uncertainty going forward. And as you mentioned, well, this new administration might breathe an air of hope for the Russian going forward. Can you give us a little bit of analysis of how perhaps a new administration has emboldened Russia? Do you think that this peace negotiation gave them the perception that perhaps they're in a more favorable position, or is there something that we're still missing there? Is there a possibility where behind closed doors they're actually also feeling some sort of pressure?
The Russians are still feeling some sort of pressure, absolutely, because their situation in the war in Ukraine is not particularly good and their domestic socio-economic problems are not getting any less. Even if, and I do have to stress this, even if some sort of, not necessarily peace deal, but some sort of end to immediate fighting happened today, even if that were to happen, Russia would still have issues at home. Having said that, going back to what I said in the beginning of this interview, what the Russians want most of all is a normalization of what they've done in Ukraine. They want world society to look at it and say, this is an acceptable way to behave in the world. This is not something that is against a world order. This is not something that is a long-term problem for the Russians standing in world affairs. And that is exactly what the American administration, with Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, so on and so forth, that is precisely what they're giving the Russians and what they seem willing to do. Look also, for instance, at Donald Trump's intemperate comments in regards to Greenland, in regards to Panama, in regards to elsewhere, Canada, and so on. He is playing along with this new world order, if you like, this idea that might makes right. Now, that's not the same as saying that the Americans will simply let the Russians run roughshod everywhere, because the Americans will want something in return for concessions to Russia. But the Americans have already, ever since Donald Trump came into office again, the Americans have already hinted to Russia and to the world that this world in which might makes right is a good world for America, is a world in which America wants to be. And I do have to stress this to your viewers. Europe should no longer assume, as a starting point, that America is an ally of European security. That is simply not the case anymore. Europe should be ready for an America that is transactional only. And then Europe will have to, and hopefully be able to, gather around, join up internally, build up internal economic and political and military strength to be ready to go into this new and rather unsettling world.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight, and we'll have to see how the negotiation develop. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko says that the country's authorities are gearing up for elections. A presidential vote, according to him, will be held by the end of the year.
Petro Poroshenko has gone so far as to claim that the vote will take place precisely on October 26th. He claims that the country's state printing service is currently calculating the number of ballots that would be needed for an election. Poroshenko also said that he received this information from anonymous sources within Volodymyr Zelensky's office, who are also cited by local media. The parliament leader of the incumbent Ukrainian president's party has denied these claims. He says that all parties agreed that elections cannot be held until at least 6 months have passed after martial law is lifted. Volodymyr Zelensky's term was supposed to end on May 20th, 2024, but was extended due to the ongoing conflict.
The United Nations expert on human rights in Russia, Marina Katsanova, has warned that the lives of 2,000 political prisoners held in Russia are still at risk.
The UN's experts on rights in Russia emphasized the dire situation of thousands of political prisoners on the first anniversary of Alexei Navalny's death. Katsanova has called for the immediate release of those who are still imprisoned. Navalny, a prominent Russian oppositionist, died while being held in a Russian penal colony above the Arctic Circle. The UN expert said that Moscow failed to carry out an appropriate investigation into the oppositionist's death and therefore bore sole responsibility for it. Navalny was declared an extremist by Russian authorities, a label which the Kremlin still upholds. Any person or entity in the country who mentions him or his foundation without calling them extremist can face fines or even up to 4 years in prison for repeated offences.
Russia's investigative committee says that terrorism cases in the country surged by 40% in 2024 compared to the previous year. Russian courts handled almost 430 terrorism-related criminal cases last year.
Russia stopped investigative authorities raising the alarm about a spike in terrorism. It claims that the entities which organize terrorism-related crimes are often located abroad and influence young people, retirees and other groups. The perpetrators of these reported acts are apparently persuaded by the entities online using false pretexts to carry out various attacks. These include arson attacks on transport infrastructure, government buildings and vehicles. The investigative body says that it can classify these acts as either terrorism or sabotage, depending on the circumstances. It has also warned that the perpetrators and accomplices can face up to life imprisonment regardless of whether they were influenced by external parties. The Russian government has been exploring some steps to allegedly combat these incidents, such as preventing phone scams and blocking calls from countries that Russia deems unfriendly, like many Western states and Ukraine.
The Shopping Centers Associations, which represents hundreds of Russian malls, has called on fashion retailers to return to Russia. The reason for this request is the apparent struggles that local replacements have been facing.
Many Western fashion retailers left the Russian market in the wake of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Local Russian replacement brands stepped in to fill the gap, but it seems that their efforts were not nearly enough to make up for the losses. Some of these local firms have been even forced to close their stores. The Shopping Centers Association called for their return, referring to what it deemed, quote, possible changes in the current political landscape. This letter comes as the new US administration has been pursuing talks with Russian leadership to end the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin has called the efforts a potential step in the direction of restoring relations between the two countries.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to DVP World.